I was analyzing results from a study that I was completing. This was my first PhD study. Our lab is interested in the neural basis of consciousness. So what neural processes, what areas of the brain, what functions of the neurons, individually or in mass, can give rise to this capacity for phenomenal experience. So there is an experience to being me, an experience to being you. It comes with a precious present. It comes with a past that's immutable and a future that is altogether partially indeterminate. But why does it not happen in the dark? Plenty of things within your body and within your mind do happen in the dark. You're walking, for example. Unless you actively pay attention to it, it's in the back of the mind and altogether out of your control until you do start paying attention to it. So why is it that some processes like walking are in the dark, but other things like, for example, this conversation here, I'm actively paying attention and I'm actively perceiving you, and it's accompanied by really rich sensory stimuli, very rich qualia. And so our job is to figure out what gives rise to that. And specifically, we're interested in bodily consciousness. So your brain is not operating by itself. It's not in a vat, but it's very intimately connected to the physiological system that sustains and stimulates it. Your body recurrently and constantly updates and informs your brain, both about the internal content of the body, how the body is doing, is it damaged, is it physiologically aroused? And this information will, in overt and covert ways, influence your cognition. So our task with this project was to see how brain-body synchrony, communication, specifically oscillatory synchrony between the EEG, heart rates, breath, and your gastric cycles would change as a function of different states that a neurotypical healthy individual would experience. So we took a group of healthy neurotypical UCSB students and we placed them in 3 conditions, counterbalanced. They meditated, they were recorded at rest, they were recorded during cognitive task, they were counting backwards by 7s from 1,000. And what I did was that I was interested specifically in one, how their frequency, the instantaneous frequency, so that is the time resolved changes in how fast any one EEG band is, how fast your heart rate, your stomach, or your breathing frequency would be. And we wanted to see how the occurrence with which these might align to one another, that could enable some form of phase-phase coupling. So for some greater exposition for the audience, any oscillatory rhythm, any brainwave for that matter, can be decomposed into 3 parts. It can be decomposed into frequency, how fast. It can be decomposed into power or amplitude, the strength of the signal. And it can be decomposed into phase, which is just the time-resolved process of its waveform. So the sinusoid as it resolves in time. And you could look at synchrony between different rhythms of different frequencies, such as between the EEG and breath, for example, and you can combine any 2 of these 3 components. And so we were interested specifically in phase-phase coupling, so the waveforms of your cardiovascular or gastrointestinal rhythms coupling with the EEG. And in doing so, we estimated frequency, and then we looked at how well their frequencies would align to enable this. So in essence, in very simple words, we were looking at how organized the brain was within itself and how organized the brain was in relation to the cardiovascular system as well as the gastrointestinal system. And then on top of that, we also looked at phase amplitude coupling, one of the topics that we'll see here at this conference, whereby the waveform of a slow rhythm, either breath or your gastric cycles, would scaffold the excitability of a network or local cortical excitability. And specifically, we're interested in how much the brain would align itself to the body and vice versa. And what we found was that as a function of active cognitive processing, moving someone from a meditative to a resting state to a difficult cognitive task, we found that there was a linear relationship in the alignment of their brain and their body. So as a function of cognitive processing, your brain and body synchronize more together. And really interestingly, what we found was that the synchrony seemed to follow your classic fight or flight or rest and digest divisions. Synchrony between your cardiovascular system and your brain was enhanced as a function of cognitive processing, but synchrony between your stomach and your brain was suppressed as a function of cognitive processing. So the more you're engaged with the task, the more you require resources, and the more physiologically aroused you were, the more your heart and your breath were speaking to your brain. and on the other side of the coin, the less your stomach was speaking to your brain across the same lines. And so this conference will be presenting a more complete analysis of this. It's given me a year worth of baking and a bit more complexity to the analysis. And the point being is that the relationship between the brain and its body is not stationary, but transient and ever shifting within a single individual through different states and across time. And point being is that if it can change within a single individual through time over the course of really a mere hour of recording time, then what differences could we find in perhaps a non-neurotypical population, perhaps a neuropsychiatric population, perhaps a population that is marked by hypervigilance, marked by a reduced connection to their body, perhaps a lack of interoception, or perhaps even an overabundance of interoceptive information. What would the communication between their brain and body look like in those circumstances? But before we can do any of that, we have to start off with a single population and see how it shifts within them. And then from there, we can take the research into other populations. This research is typically done in two dimensions, state-dependent and trait-dependent. And right now, we're on the former. And so, yeah, I'm excited to present that this conference.
And so the EGG refers to the gastric functioning and the electrical activity coming from the gut. And what I remember from last year was this kind of fascinating interplay where you show that the activity that we measure in the gut electrically and the brain mirror each other as, for example, folks descend into depression and also in aging. And I think to a lot of people, it's not, well, to plenty of people, it's not intuitive that we even have brainwaves. But to people in the field of neurofeedback, neuromodulation, it's not intuitive that you can even measure activity from the gut. So how do you do that?
Yeah. So everything we're doing is not novel in methodology. In fact, I'm only looking at stomach-brain synchrony because it's been discovered before. So we're taking the methods of several different studies and making sure that the signals that we are measuring, the stomach, the heart, and breath, are conventional and not open to any confounds. So for the stomach specifically, for a broader note, all of the activity that we're measuring across the physiological system is measured with BioPac systems equipment. So this is a local bioinformation company based here in Santa Barbara.
Coupon code in the description.
Oh, that's right. Subscribe. And so the stomach itself was measured with a 3-electrode array, one below the solar plexus and one below the left pectoral muscle, essentially straddling the stomach body, so to say. Keep in mind that if I were to orient myself towards the screen, the stomach sits below or around the solar plexus and then curves up underneath the left pectoral muscle. And so we essentially straddled the central stomach body.
So wait, you said 3 electrodes.
Yeah.
Solar plexus, left pectoral, and then where's the other
ground
one?
electrode.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this system shared a ground electrode across all of our physiological measurements. We also had 2 electrodes across the clavicles, one underneath the right clavicle and one between the space of your left chest to your left shoulder to measure your EKG, an elastic band across the abdomen for breath, and a light diode on the left thumb for PPG. And all of this was collected across a single amplifier. Our EEG was collected on a separate amplifier specifically for EEG, connected to a 19-channel cap. And the 2 amplifiers were synchronized together using some shared signals. And so we pulsed both amplifiers at the start of conditions, during the condition, and as well as at the end, so we can properly align the time series together and allow for this cross-modal analysis.
So how does this relate to consciousness?
So point being is that going into this project, we were aware, one, that the body recurrently and constantly updates and informs the brain. 2, there is overt ways in which it updates the brain. So for example, interoception, the experience of being within one's own skin, the internal sense of the body relied very specifically on information and synchrony with the body. And then there was covert ways in which cognition was influenced by the body. For example, enhanced fearful face detection at systole. So this is the period following the heartbeat, where the baroreceptors, the pressure receptors, were highly active. And there was also enhanced fearful face detection at inhalation. And so those were covert ways in which cognition was recurrently influenced. And then we have very overt ways, the sense of the body being highly supported by communication with the body. And so if we take a representation of consciousness, and that is my, for example, my self-report cognition, for example, I'm sitting here, I could feel the cold across my hands, across my feet. I could feel the material of my clothes upon me. I could feel the alcohol coursing through my veins and making me a little woozy. And these things, for example, just our sensory perception, it's constantly informed by the body. And so if we were to take just my sensory content as a representation for my consciousness, then, well, consciousness is recurrently and constantly being updated by the body. And so really the point being is that we are combining someone's qualia with their capacity for consciousness. So if these qualia rely on the body, then consciousness relies on these qualia. By virtue, consciousness does rely on communication with the body. And the flip of this is that if you look at neuropsychiatric populations that may be comorbid with physiological illness, so common pairings within the field that you'll see talked about at this conference, as well as many other places, is IBS and PTSD, panic with hyperventilation, anxiety, and cardiovascular disease. A long list of different pairings wherein mental health seems to be tied to physical health. And so if communication is necessary for consciousness and that communication is interrupted, whether by physiological illness or by neuropsychiatric illness, then it is another side to the evidence in saying that brain-body communication is necessary or fundamental to conscious experience. Now, the question that rises out of this is, well, would a brain in a vat be conscious? A brain that it's isolated from its body? And by virtue of this argument, I would have to say no. Or at least its conscious content and quality would be so drastically different from the ones that you and I experience within our physiologically entangled nervous system that the difference is fully categorical.
There is this 1 over F sort of like exponential relationship of like frequencies stacked on top of each other, starting from like the super slow rhythms, going up to like the brain waves and like the higher frequency rhythms. So could you just give us a kind of breakdown of like what that frequency spectrum looks like and how the experience of consciousness, at least from like a numerical perspective, supports this notion that like if you were just a vat, a brain in a vat, it wouldn't be the same, or it wouldn't even necessarily be able to exist at all?
Difficult question after a glass of wine. So the 1 over F distribution for greater exposition is the background component to the EEG. Any brainwave that we look at is embedded within a background of noise, which is just the sum total of all activity within the brain. The 1 over F distribution refers to this the exponentially decreasing power at higher frequencies, and hence we get the shape of something along this line. As we move towards the higher frequency range, we see decreased power. And so the point being is that we have very strong power spectral density at this very low frequency range. We're looking at around the 1 hertz range, sub-hertz range. And the connection here to these sub-hertz oscillations within the body, specifically in respiration and gastric cycles, is most definitely not lost upon me. So another bit about the 1 over F distribution is that one of the key points that we look at, really you look at it in 2 points. It's the offset of the aperiodic component. So how much does an oscillation need to distinguish itself from the background noise so that it can be actually called an oscillation? And then the exponent, of the 1 over F distribution, which refers to the steepness of the distribution. So a flat distribution refers to wholly uncorrelated activity at the brain, essentially not very much signal in the brain. And a very steep 1 over F distribution indicates highly temporally correlated activity. So perhaps the brain is in fact working on something. One of the really interesting findings out of this bit is that as you get older, this 1 over F distribution becomes flatter with age. Part of the neural noise hypothesis is that aging is associated with an increasingly noisy baseline of activity, and would hence explain the haze with which grandpa looks at you. Now, one of the really interesting findings that came out quite recently, we're looking at 22, 23, Daniel Kluger found that fluctuations in the 1 over F distribution are correlated to the phase of respiration. And so the steepness, how temporally correlated activity is within the brain, or specifically how organized activity is within the brain, is locked to your inspiration. So that is the inhalation during your breath. And so point being is that can global organization of your brain be tied to physiological rhythms? At least in this one instance, yes. Now, Daniel Kluger is really breaking new ground within this field, and those findings were quite recent, but would definitely speak to your point that even this background component of EEG is highly dependent on the body itself. And again, comes back to the point that the brain in the vat likely is not conscious, or at least the consciousness that it experiences is wholly different from what you or I have.
What should people look out for in your talk? I know we've covered a lot of ground here. We're here at the School of Neurotherapy conference in beautiful Santa Barbara, and we are at night 1, and you're presenting tomorrow. Saturday
at 2 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. The point of this talk really is to allow my very new research assistant to demonstrate themselves. And so this is Tara Pugliese, a neurofield research specialist here and our new EEG specialist in the Meta Lab at UCSB. She will be presenting a new design for our upcoming study to disassociate a number of different factors that confounded our study 1, the study that I'll be presenting. So in doing any state-based study, particularly one that uses meditation or cognitive task, the things that will confound is 1, arousal, physiological arousal. The more difficult the task is, the faster your breathing rate increases, an indication that your arousal increases. There's task-related stress. It's simply more difficult to participate in difficult cognitive tasks relative to their own rest. In our study, it was task orientation. One task was an interoceptive task. The other one was an abstract cognitive task. So there's a number of different drivers which can be driving brain-body synchrony, all of which will be noted during the talk. And her task is to design and complete a study that can dissociate these things. What exactly is the communication between your brain and body dependent on? And she'll be the highlight of the talk. So the talk will be part 1, myself covering study 1 and the very new, very cool results. And part 2, wherein Tara will be presenting this new design that she's concocted, as well as some additional implications for clinical work, because this is a clinical conference. And so look out for her talk.
Asa Young, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll see you next year. Thanks for watching EEG World. Subscribe to my channel. Let's change people's brains and change the world.
Indeed. Cheers.